There's also this extraordinary relationship of how you are all seated, and why do you need to be seated, on a rake in a proportion to a screen which is vertical. It does not have to be like this anymore. It's absolutely possible, and I'm sure you've seen many, many examples, for us to maybe project the imagery of the screen, indeed on the ceiling, on the floors, make it 360 degrees. We've had these ideas around for a long time, but there still is a way that they have not been implemented. And relevant to that, I'm always intrigued, and really this is the subject matter of this first clip, is the notion that the projection on a screen does not affect the screen. It may be said, perhaps, that when you put a theater play in a theater, it somehow affects the theater. But then again, the theater and certainly the opera house are three-dimensional activities, and maybe they don't have all the exact characteristics, certainly, that cinema does. And of course, if we change this sort of architecture, then there's every reason, indeed, we would need to make changes with the whole notion of what a cinema does. But let me actually make a demonstration of a notion of an expanded cinema, which no longer wants to concentrate on the singularity of a single frame. Let's just talk for one moment about the frame. The frame is a totally artificial proposition. I don't see you in a frame, and you don't see me in a frame. I've also, just like you, got a gyroscopic head. Never ever stand still. And I don't know whether you remember film going all the way back to Czechoslovakia in the 1950s, where drivers in cars driving along highways, their eyes were photographed, and it was absolutely amazing to see that the eyes were never, never, never still. The only time your eyes are still are when you are dead. So the combination of moving eyes and a moving gyroscopic head really does make the notion of the singularity of the frame really absurd. So there's one thing here I think we have to change and try and find an organization for the collapse, the breakage, the evaporation, the destruction of the frame. One of my ambitions then, if I can indeed continue to make cinema, is certainly to be very much concerned with the notions of multi-screen cinema, which certainly seems to satisfy my objections to the singularity of the frame and also offers you extraordinary opportunities for breaking down the architecture in places like this. Okay, about 5 years ago, the Design Museum in Milan offered me an opportunity to make, I suppose, a resume of Italian design, probably since 1945. It was indeed a celebration of Italian design. I wanted to be much more ambitious, and I wanted to take us away, essentially, from the ephemerality, shall we say, of domestic design, and do a much larger exposition of all Italian notions of representation, visual representation. So I suggested, why don't we do something much bigger? Why don't we start and cover the last 2,000 years, and indeed start with a painting in Pompeii and take us all the way up till now? But why is it that we have to play all the time with a parallelogram, a rectangle with 4 right angles? Why cannot we do something far more interesting? So we first of all wanted to not only have many screens, but to somehow cut and crop and organize those screens that themselves were no longer subject to this desire for 4 rectangles. Okay, here's a picture of a communist red adult of 35 living probably in Bologna, familiarly known as the Red City. You can see that we've made this diagram to show you a sense of scale. So the first elected screen is, as you can see, very, very big. And it's also shaped like 1/4 of a circle. Please try and imagine this as a 3-dimensional activity. Unfortunately, due to the limitations of this cinema, I can only show you things on a flat 2-dimensional screen. And the idea then that the actual shape, which is suggested, and the notion that it might be 1/4 of the planet Earth, is to suggest that's where all the wide shots, all the spectacular shots, all the overviews take place. Second screen is shaped rather eccentrically like a Roman triumphal arch. Are there any Italians in the audience? It's only the Italians, I think, who can invent the triumphal arch with all its pomposity, its triumphalism, etc., etc. And of course, the rest of Europe has followed suit. So there's again a way, if we want to associate the content of your projection with a shape, I don't have to underline what should in fact be projected on that particular shape. We are, I think, probably still in an age of classicism, despite Libeskind, despite Gehry, who are determined to make our architecture organic and not classical anymore. And I certainly believe that the notion of certainly this room, and for the moment, indeed, this screen is offering us verticals and horizontals. I want to have the widest possible screen, again, to represent all the notions of panoramas. This is even bigger than the wide screens that appeared in cinemas in the 1950s and 1960s. And again, if you want to try and make fitness for purpose, surely it's absolutely the right shape for showing snakes. Here is the right shape for showing giraffes. Over and over again in the history of painting, of course, painters have fashioned their canvases to be somehow appropriate to the content that's portrayed on it. This particular shape, though ostensibly indeed still a rectangle on end, is torqued at the top to remind you not only of the fact that it is meant to be three-dimensional, but also to have an indication that we don't have to stand still in association with this idea of you sitting there and watching a screen there. Okay, I have an awful lot to say, so I've given myself 3 footnote screens as well. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 screens. An awful lot of space to fill. And there are other things to be considered. It's now possible to change the transparency, the translucency, the opaqueness of a screen. We can attach them to an electric current, and on the fly, so to speak, as you actually watch the screens, you can completely keep changing their notion of translucency and opacity. There is a way that indeed the space is arranged such that you can wander. There are no seats here, and you can see screens within screens, and therefore you can see images within images. This is an idea, of course, that is intimated in all sorts of, I suppose, exhibition phenomena around the world, but I've yet to see it actually in practice. I have prepared my first science fiction film to be portrayed on a space like this. Needless to say, I have no money whatsoever to do it. It's a dream. Here I'm going to show you, I suppose, which is really documentary in content. When you come to look at the subject matter, you will see indeed all the familiar sections of the way that art history is divided up in the last, indeed, 2,000 years. But there is a continual image that everything in this room, down to the socks on your feet, had to be designed by somebody. So there's a way I'm always wanting to remind you of the human figure. Not this little red silhouette, but figures in flesh and blood. All right, let me show you what we did. Here we go. Then we had an opportunity to work on a painting by Veronese in Venice called The Marriage of Cana. Now, I rather suspect that you probably know the Marriage of Cana is a depiction of Christ's first miracle, whereby he turned the water into wine. I always think the story is a very, very badly disguised recounting, in fact, of the marriage of Christ. Let me show you, just to give you an idea, there was a way that every painting created its own strategy, and the Marriage of Cana, of course, is a Jewish wedding, and it has 126 characters in it, and paintings don't have soundtracks, but cinema certainly does, so I gave dialogue to all of these 126 people at this very famous wedding.
Listen to him. He will surprise you.
You were not surprised?
They have no wine.
It could have been anticipated an hour ago.
And even if they had wine, what is it to us? No,